Hey folks, Matt here, and today I'll be ranking the studio albums from the American death metal band Death, a highly influential band of the genre, not to mention having a rather polarizing discography, so you are definitely going to want to stay tuned. So before I get into the ranking, it might be useful to go through a brief history of the band. So let's do that now. Originally formed in 1983 under the name Mantis, the band was comprised of Chuck Schuldiner, Rick Ross, and Cam Lee. After some lineup changes and a handful of demo recordings, Mantis changed their name to Death in late 1984. And it's probably good to know that at this time in America, not a lot of bands were playing what would come to be known as death metal. So Death has often been considered one of the pioneering bands of the genre, notably to come out of Florida. Fast forward to April of 1986, and with the release of their Mutilation demo, they caught the attention of Combat Records, who signed the band that same year. The band had actually recorded their first album twice, as Combat didn't like the recording quality the first time around. So Death had to record the album again at a different place and with a different producer, and thus the final version of Scream Bloody Gore was born. As for how I discovered the band, I came in on that very first album when it was brand new. Initially, my pal Eric had bought it, but then he let me tape it off him. Then I bought my own vinyl copy soon after. I was already primed for this increase in musical aggression through my love for similar bands that came before them, including Venom, Slayer, and Possessed. So Death was pretty much going to be a winner with me right away. So with that, let's get to the ranking. Coming in at number 7 is the band's 6th studio album, released in 1995 by Roadrunner Records. This is Symbolic. So a bit of context here, this was intended to be the final Death album, with Chuck wanting to move on to his Control Denied project. He also didn't want this to be promoted as a death metal album, but the label did just that anyways. Keep that in mind when we get to the actual final Death album coming up. I also mentioned all of this because, except for the vocals, this really does come off as a harsh, progressive thrash metal album with some up-tempo moments, and that's fine. I mean, there is some decent songwriting here for what it is, so I wouldn't consider this a distant 7th place on the list, nor an album that isn't without some merit. But if you're expecting classic Death, it's largely not here. To secure that, we have a couple of lineup changes with underground Florida musicians who weren't even known at the time, such as bassist Kelly Conlon, who immediately went on to Monstrosity after this, as well as Bobby Keeble, who went on to other progressive metal bands, as well as working as a jazz guitarist. In all fairness, I do hear some scant callbacks to both Spiritual Healing and Human, but simply not enough of those elements dominate this record. Chuck's vocals are also a little less death growl here, and considerably more yelly and somewhat higher in pitch. Tonally, they also fall a little flat sometimes. We also get more moments of slow, progressive passages that meander quite a bit, sometimes dreamy, sometimes disjointed, and often sharply breaking away from the more aggressive parts. Some might feel that it works in some cases, though I do feel it takes me out of the album sometimes. Anyways, favorites are Zero Tolerance, 1000 Eyes, and especially Misanthrope. I should also mention that this album has been out of print on vinyl since 2014, but had been reissued as of May of 2025, which is the reissue you see here. Yep, had to wait 11 years to get this on the format, but here it is. Anyways, at number 7 is Symbolic. Coming in at number 6 is the band's 7th and final studio album, released in 1998 by Nuclear Blast Records. This is The Sound of Perseverance. So, in many respects, this material has a lot more musically in common with Chuck's follow-up project, Control Denied, which would make a whole lot of sense considering this was also the Control Denied lineup. We have Shannon Hamm on guitar, Scott Clendenin on bass, and Richard Christie on drums. But the label wanted one more album under the Death moniker, and so we got this. Anyways, one clear difference that jumps out from all previous albums is Chuck's radical vocal style change to an almost screechy blackened sound, something that might make or break this album for folks. I'm good with it. Also, we get more of a return to the aggression of pre-Symbolic albums, though still with the angular and off-kilter prog riffing, mixed with up-tempo, thrashy death moments. Production is clean, but it also diminishes some of the punch and delivery of the guitars. We're also getting longer songs here, with many of them between 6 and 8 minutes in length. Bass guitar is certainly more prominent here than on other Death albums, and is more focused upon in certain tracks. And of course, we should discuss the cover tune at the end of this record, which is Painkiller, originally done by Judas Priest. Not the only cover they do on a record, and we'll get to the other one later. As for this one, Chuck sounds awful on it, and he is way out of Halford's league. Even musically, there's nothing really unique or interesting going on with it, so it doesn't even need to be here. Favorites are Spirit Crusher, Flesh and the Power It Holds, and A Moment of Clarity. So because this album brings back some of that needed aggression and some slightly better songwriting, it barely sneaks past Symbolic for me. Admittedly, I feel these last two albums are a bit too clinical and sometimes bloodless for my liking, which is why they rest here at the bottom. But you might feel differently. You should let me know in the comments what you love about them, because I do know that they have their fans. So my number 6 choice is the sound of Perseverance. Coming in at number 5 is the band's 5th studio album, released in 1993 by Relativity Records. This is Individual Thought Patterns. So although the heaviness of previous records is here, there's a lot more of what I would call controlled chaos on this album, with rapid shifts in tempo and mood, not just from one track to the other, but even many times within a single song, as well as a lot more DiGiorgio's prominent and insane bass lines all over the place, and some disjointed vocal cadences within Chuck's standard death growls. We even get some groove riffing at times between shreddy runs and melodic sweeps. As for lineup changes, this is the first Death album to have drummer Gene Hoglan, formerly and now currently back in Dark Angel, as well as the final Death album for bassist Steve DiGiorgio, and the only Death album to include former and later current King Diamond guitarist Andy LaRocque, the last of whom certainly bringing in some of his noodly and occasionally neoclassical solo style here and there. Anyways, favorites on this one are Trapped in a Corner, Mentally Blind, and The Philosopher. So it's an album that drifts away from their classic death metal sound at such a degree that it doesn't always hold my interest, but there is enough here to not relegate it to the bottom of the list. Hell, it's even really good at times, which means check out my favorite tracks that I just mentioned. Anyways, at number 5 is Individual Thought Patterns. And number 4 is the band's debut studio album, released in 1987 by Combat Records. This is Scream, Bloody Gore. So, just to get this out of the way here, many do consider this to be the very first death metal album, and I think a strong case can be made for that, even if Seven Churches by Possessed came out 2 years earlier and is claimed by Chuck himself to be a major influence on death, so maybe factor that in as well. At any rate, this album definitely takes that influence, as well as some of the aggression from Slayer and other bands, and comes out the other end with a more developed sound, providing a nice mix of slow crunch and rapid tremolo riffs, slamming drums, and some truly gruesome and gory lyrics. But if I were to complain about anything, and this really is a minor complaint given the material here, it's that the balance strongly favors drums quite a bit, and the guitar tone is a little on the tinny side, but somehow it still manages a profound heaviness, likely due to the speed and force of the playing, as well as Chuck's gasping death growls. This was also the only Death album not to be recorded at the infamous Morrisound recording studio, so if you're comparing this to future releases, that difference might be a bit more than noticeable. Also, the back cover credits John Hamm on rhythm guitar, though he's nowhere on this record. So this album is the product of Chuck on vocals, bass, and guitar, and drummer Chris Reifert as well. Also, this is Reifert's only Death album, as he went on to form Autopsy later in 1987. Favorites are Zombie Ritual, Baptized in Blood, and especially Evil Dead. So while the Death albums that were mentioned earlier are more technical, more proficient, and better produced, I feel that Scream Bloody Gore has a brutality, aggression, and gore factor, not to mention some very, very classic tracks that all push this record further up my list. So at number 4 is Scream Bloody Gore. Coming in at number 3 is the band's second studio album, released in 1988 by Combat Records. This is Leprosy. So while this is primarily a death metal record, similar in delivery to the first album, we're also getting some faint hints of what's to come in terms of progressive elements. We're also getting more variety in track tempos, but also in riff and solo work, and the overall songwriting has certainly improved. Lyrics in particular strayed a little at times from the template established on Scream Bloody Gore, with tracks now exploring more mature content and less horror movie stuff. This is also Chuck with a couple members of the classic lineup of Massacre, so Rick Ross and Bill Andrews. Terry Butler, also of Massacre, is credited, but he actually doesn't play on this album. However, he did write some of the music. Anyways, at different points after this album, Roz, Andrews, and Butler would rejoin Massacre and release the incredibly killer death metal album From Beyond, which I would highly recommend, and in fact does overlap a little bit with this record. So if you like one album, you should definitely check out the other. This is also one of those records where you can hear what influenced future bands, with a lot of stylistic choices pretty much starting right here on this very album. Also, this is the first Death album produced at Morris Sound Recording, and the jump in production is fairly noticeable, especially so in some of the more technical and melodic moments here. Anyways, favorite tracks are Born Dead, Open Casket, and especially Pull the Plug. So Leprosy is one of those albums that has a rather elevated status for a number of reasons I just mentioned. In fact, many people do pick this one as their very favorite Death album, likely due to the balance between technicality and brutality. But for me, I still have two more albums to go that I feel have something a little bit extra from this already stellar record. So at number 3 is Leprosy. At number 2 is the band's fourth studio album, released in 1991 by Relativity Records. This is Human. So with a further addition of progressive elements from their previous album, production matches suit with a sharper guitar tone, highly audible bass guitar, and a fuller drum sound. Chuck's vocals also continue with the clarity established on Spiritual Healing, with lyrics likewise continuing from that album in terms of more introspective topics. And it might not be a stretch to connect some of that further exploration into progressive realms to the lineup change here, with newest members Sean Reinert on drums and Paul Masvidal on guitar, both from prog metal band Cynic, as well as new bassist Steve DiGiorgio from Sadist and his wild and frequently off-kilter bass lines. I mean, Chuck was already headed in a prog direction, and so it's clear that he chose these musicians to continue on that track. Still plenty of death metal here with utterly crushing and dizzying riffs, as well as pummeling drum work. I mean, the double bass alone is utterly relentless. This is also where Death brings us their first instrumental track, Cosmic Sea, which is heavy with experimentation, ambiance, spaciness, and yes, progressive elements. It's mellow and kind of weird by comparison to the rest of the tracks, and might take some people out of the record a little bit. Not so much with me, but I get where some people might feel that way. Much later pressings of this album also have a Kiss cover song on them, namely God of Thunder. Now, I'm a big Kiss fan and I love death metal, but this cover does absolutely nothing for me. And it feels vastly out of place both on this album and from this band. So, there's that. Anyways, favorites are Secret Face, Lack of Comprehension, and especially Suicide Machine. So I gotta say, both Human and my number 1 album choice are mostly neck and neck for first place because they are both killer albums. However, the more aggressive edge has to go to my number 1 choice, but again, just by a hair. Anyways, my number 2 album is Human. And my number 1 album is the band's third studio album, released in 1990 by Combat Records. This is, of course, Spiritual Healing. So right away, there is a sharp clarity in vocals from the first 2 albums. Still gruff and growly, but there is no mishearing the lyrics on this one at all. And it's hard not to notice that Chuck has some occasional effects on his voice to provide some added creepiness. It definitely works. This is also the one and only Death album with additional guitarist James Murphy, who's done a few one-album appearances for bands, including Obituary and Cancer. And his presence here is significant, as his teaming up with Chuck to share riff and solo duties, and the way they play off each other, is one of the crowning jewels of this record. Also, last album with Butler and Andrews, as they went off to join Roz and Massacre. And another last thing is that this is the final Death album art done by Ed Repka, who handled Death's covers up to this point. Admittedly, not my favorite Repka cover for Death, as it is a little goofy. Rather, I favor the first album cover. As for the lyrics on Spiritual Healing, the band has moved even further into more real-world topics, including those of serial killers, drug addiction, abortion, bipolar disorder, and faith healers, to mention some. Production is certainly cleaner than on previous efforts, but not at the expense of heaviness. Some might even notice a little bit of mellow Death making its way in, notably in those sweeping solo passages, as well as more progressive song structures, but still intertwined with crushing death riffs and brutal breakdown moments. I'm also going to say that the drumming on this record is a marked improvement in terms of variety and technicality from that on Leprosy. It's still Andrews, but he really does step it up on this record, and conspicuously so. Anyways, favorites here are Living Monstrosity, Defensive Personalities, and Genetic Reconstruction. So overall, this is the sweet spot for me, with Death's conjoining of death metal and progressive metal. It's proficient and complex, but also crushing and dark. While I love many of the other albums, I always find myself coming back to this one, more often than not. So my number one album from Death is Spiritual Healing. So this list definitely reminds me of what I love about this band, chiefly that balance between the technical and the brutal, which is struck for me between Leprosy and Human. While I love Scream Bloody Gore, it had to fall right behind those three for lacking those mature playing styles, while the last three albums fall back further for being more technical at the expense of aggression and punch. But all of these albums are well worth hearing, and I would say make up your own minds about where they rank, because I think a lot of where you might put these albums will rely on what your musical expectations are. I mean, we all have them, right? Anyways, if you're new to this band and you're wanting a crash course on them, I would additionally recommend this compilation album. This is Fate, the Best of Death, originally released in 1992 by Combat Records, with this reissue released in 2023 by Relapse Records. Some of the songs I mentioned are here, though only up to and including their Human album, so no tracks from the final three Death albums. But definitely check this one out. Fate, the Best of Death. And of course, it should be said that the entire ranking salutes the life and music of the late Chuck Schuldiner, who unfortunately passed away from brain cancer in 2001, 2 years after recording the one and only Control Denied album. The Death albums were immeasurably influential on so many bands and subgenres of death metal, and the man deserves all the respect he gets, and more. Rest in peace, Chuck. So let me know if you agree or disagree with my ranking. Perhaps you have your own order that you feel these should go in. Let me know that and anything else relevant in the comments below. But I don't just do album rankings here at the Accusation Network. I make videos on metal vinyl collecting, as well as classic and modern metal in general. If you like the sound of that and you have yet to subscribe to my channel, I would really appreciate it if you hit that button and did all of that. Also, maybe like this video and share out this and other videos of mine with your friends on social media. And of course, thank you for watching as always, and I'll see you in the next video.